Farming Conference. I'm Rob York. I was asked to chair this last night, so things could go in any direction. I'm going to do the housekeeping first. Use Twitter, social media, with care and curate it. Hashtag, as you know, is hashtag ORFC19. And the other thing is the look at the website for the whole conference, conference. Things are moving very fast, big tight schedules, so have a look at that for you. There's timings. The other thing is fire alarm might well go off at any time this morning. Keep us on our toes. People might keep coming and going. Okay, we're here to talk about the agricultural bill. For 70 years, nothing's really happened in the way of agricultural bills, and then suddenly there's a lot of stuff that the government is bringing forward. Not just an agricultural bill, environment bill, biodiversity gains, food strategies, lots of stuff going on. But we're going to focus this morning on the agricultural bill. Who in the room are farmers? How many farmers we got? Land managers and farmers. I don't want to be too strict, so what have we got? 1, 20, maybe 30? We say 30, 25. Miles, did you put your hands up?
Yeah, I've got 4 chickens.
4 chickens, right? 4 chickens at the back. Anyway. Okay, commercial. Well, we won't go to detail on that. Okay, who fed into the Health and Harmony paper? Who actually fed their own piece? Okay, slightly less, 10, 15. Okay, right. Okay, so what's going to happen now is that we are going to discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly with our wonderful contestants. And they're going to have about 7 minutes, I think. 7 minutes, very straight. And then we're going to open it up to the floor. Now, when we open it to the floor, we want to hear lots of different views. You can be as intense as you want, but we're looking for heterogeneity. We're looking for diversity. So I'm going to be a tough, strict chair. I will cut you off if you start to warble on or start to do a mission statement. So we want to hear lots of views. We want to hear about hopes and dreams and challenges and synergies, stuff like that. These are quite long words this early in the morning. I think we should crack on. Have I missed anything? I don't think so. The good. Tom is going to start there.
Right. So my name's Tom Lancaster. I work at the RSPB. But this is, I've been asked just to talk about the good. So we think other things about the agriculture bill, but this is an unapologetic, optimistic pitch as to why it's a potentially positive development for farming, food and the natural environment. For people from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it's important to state this is a predominantly English bill, and similar things or different things are happening in the other 3 countries of the UK. So starting off, I think it's important to say that public money for public goods, which is at the heart of the agriculture bill, is something that the sort of NGO movement and the wider progressive farming movement have been pushing for a long time. And really this bill is in part the culmination of decades worth of work on behalf of many people within the sector and beyond. And it's, I guess, the departure of the UK from the European Union which has accelerated the shift toward that sort of agenda. But I don't think it's as, people talk about the opportunity to reform agriculture policy as one of the main opportunities of Brexit. Actually, I think it's just more a function of Brexit removing the parameters of what's politically possible and what's possible in terms of policy. So it has expanded the opportunities, but people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and the Institute of Economic Affairs, they talk about Brexit as an opportunity to reform agriculture policy in a completely different direction. So what Brexit really does is remove the sort of inertia, the comfort blanket of European policy and predominantly the common agricultural policy, and just expands the parameters of what's possible, both in terms of the good and the bad. So in that context, the stakes couldn't really be any higher. So Vicky asked me to sort of say what you should do going away from this session, and really what you should just do is go away and be active. on whatever you care about, because now is no time for complacency. So whatever you care about, whatever you're passionate about, now is the time to go home and try and advocate for that. So in terms of the opportunities that the bill presents, the RSPB, our allies in the farming movement and the environmental sector have been pushing for this for a long time, so we've embraced the general direction of the bill. And really the central premise behind the bill is one where in the future farmers can get a better return from the market for the food they produce, and public support is refocused onto those things that the market doesn't provide, also known as public goods. So those would be things like water quality, biodiversity, public access, flood risk management, beautiful landscapes, all those things which you can't pay for at the till. And our basic position is that that central premise is the right one. And also, if you're thinking about how you can create a stable policy environment for farmers and the natural environment that's likely to endure across political cycles and economic cycles, you need a sort of relatively stable policy, and therefore one that commands a consensus view, and that, to us, is the one that is most capable of doing that. And I'll try and illustrate why we think the bill is good around three sort of core aspects within it: public goods, the agricultural transition, and this sort of transparency in the supply chain and the clauses in the bill around those issues. So clause 1 effectively lists what the bill regards as public goods, and we've been quite clear in saying we're fairly happy with that. It includes things like climate change mitigation and adaptation, improving the natural environment, public access, animal welfare. And in terms of how that could be used, in addition to the other subsection in clause 1 around starting and improving agricultural productivity, you could see big public payments, sort of more akin to Pillar 1 type payments than agri-environment in terms of the scale of funding received for delivering against those public goods. You could see smart investments in things like processing and other facilities to enable horticulturalists to expand their fruit and veg production, so tapping into some of the public health and healthy food dimensions that Sustain and others have talked about. So you could see that clause 1 being used really intelligently to invest in renewal within the sector and really sort of innovative ways of improving the natural environment alongside improving profitability and productivity. In terms of the transition, the bill sets out a clear time-limited transition from 2021 for 7 years. So that gives a clear time frame, and that's something that we asked for in our advocacy ahead of the bill, because that's really important for farmers to be able to have a date by which they can aim for and plan for. And in that time period, the bill could be used to enable farmers to adjust through that transition. So invest in things like skills and advice, in smart productivity investments to improve resource efficiency as well as the environment. There are provisions in there for delinking, which, if any of you have looked into, are about effectively enabling farmers to cash in their direct payments entitlements for a lump sum, and that could be used to invest in the farm business. It could be used to invest in a managed exit, and alongside that we would also want to see support provided to new entrants, so you get some renewal within the sector and some new farmers coming into the sector, which I think most people agree is really needed. So the most important thing, though, within that transition time frame is that the state plays an active role in managing that transition, because if the UK has proved anything in the last few years, it's that we're really bad at industrial change. All you've got to do is go to former mining communities or shipbuilding communities to see that. So we need to learn from those past mistakes and see an active state. And finally, on fairness in the supply chain, the bill includes some potentially groundbreaking provisions around regulating the relationship between farmers and first purchasers, around producer organisations, around data collection. Those could be bundled up to transform the position of farmers within the supply chain, so that rather than being sort of effectively price takers and dependent on subsidy, they could instead command a much better place within the supply chain and get a better price for the food that they produce. There are big gaps to fill around funding, around duties, around detail, which we don't have time to say more about now. But what my priority is in the coming months is, during the rest of the passage of the bill, it's to focus on defending the wins that we've got and sort of heading off any of the threats, because what's most important now its momentum and maintaining the momentum that the bill provides, so that we can get it through the Commons and through the Lords in roughly the shape that it's in, and then use that as the foundation for building toward the better future that I think we all believe is needed. And that's my piece.
Great, thank you, Tom. So we've had the good, now the bad. Which is you, Steve. Yeah.
Morning all, Stephen Green. So I'm actually speaking here as a farmer, with my farmer hat on. And I was asked to talk about the bad in the bill. And actually I struggled with that one a little bit because I think there's quite a lot of good in it. But I looked at it and thought, well, what is the bad in it? And I guess my question is, who is the bill for? Because actually the agricultural bill as it stands, I see it very much as a bill that's been championed by the NGO sector, and I think the bad is that as farmers we've failed miserably to engage in this agricultural bill. We've devolved that responsibility largely to membership organisations, and we've really failed to engage in it. There's a few farmers in the room here. Not all of us have engaged. Some of us have, some of us haven't. But the statistics show a pretty woeful level of engagement in terms of the health and harmony responses. So, who's the bill for? It's for farmers, but farmers have failed to engage, and I think that's a bad thing. I think the bill itself doesn't have a lot of detail, and as farming businesses, we need detail to plan in terms of timeframes and certainty. But perhaps we're expecting too much. It's no more than a framework by which government can enact its policies. So there's a lot of people screaming for detail within the bill. Actually, the detail will come, but what we need as farmers is to know when those things are actually going to come and have a clearer time frame of when the different aspects will come into place. Another bad, I think, I'm pretty disappointed, like many others, that food is not mentioned. It's a farming bill, but food has got to be the fundamental part of our farming activities, and food isn't mentioned in the bill. And I think that's a really regrettable and missed opportunity. So I think that's a bad thing that's come out of it. And I don't also think there's no real direct commitment to sustainable farming practices in terms of whether that be regenerative, conservation agriculture, organic or whatever. There's no commitment to trying to support those areas of activity and help that level of innovation. Again, I think that's a bad thing. I would like to see that in the bill, and a commitment by government to support that area of activity. What's for the farming community, what will be seen as bad by some will be the end of direct support payments. For many farming businesses, their profitability is underpinned by those direct payments. Some will see it as bad, some will see it as good. My own personal view is I think we need to change, and we need to become less reliant as farmers on those direct payments. So their removal over this transition period, it's a bit difficult for me to stand here and argue for bad. There will be many in the industry that will not want to see that happen. But I think it's time that we did move those direct payments into payments for public goods and ecosystem services. So, in many ways difficult to argue the bad other than highlight where I think the bill is a bit lacking. But importantly, what should farmers do going forward from here in response to the bill and in preparing them for readiness for when it comes into passing? I think there's a lot of talk about public goods. There's a lot of confusion in the farming community what those public goods are. I think as farmers and as land managers, we need to embrace that, but we need to better understand what some of those public goods are in terms of air and soil and water and landscape and natural capital, and align our businesses in a way which allows us to step up and engage in that process of gearing into those public good payments and public good support. So what farmers should be thinking about doing now, I think, is is doing the groundwork. If history teaches us nothing else, there's going to be a massive hiatus between where we are now and where we're going to get to in a few years' time, moving away from what has been a income foregone set of payments for many activities to a outcome-based payment. This is going to be a new journey for a lot of farmers. I think what they can do is lay the groundwork now over the next few years in terms of finding out what they've got on their farm better, what birds they've got, what habitats they've got, what species they've got, engaging with their farming neighbours better than they currently are, and actually creating groups and clusters. Because what's going to come over the hill is that government are going to ask, they're not going to put programmes to farmers, they're going to ask farmers to bid for programmes, either as individuals or groups, and aligning yourself as a farming business to be better able with the right information to bid in for those programmes, lay the groundwork now and set yourself up in readiness.
It's just a test. It's just a test. It's just a test. You can stay where you are. Come on, you'll get this. It'll go off again in 10 minutes.
Okay. I'll wait for it to finish. So right on the button. So I saw on the news this morning that in the conference down the road, Mr. Gove is talking about, probably hear about a world of opportunity. I would say, in terms of getting ourselves ready and moving the game forward, farmers need to do that engagement now. And following on from the previous speaker, engage with your community, engage as farmers with your neighbours and the business supply chain, and actually use that engagement to shape the future that you want to see, rather than the one that you're going to be given.
Over to Vicky for the ugly.
The ugly.
But
Not so ugly.
and
Not so ugly.
then we'll go on to the okay after that.
So my job, and I just want to thank Rob for stepping in at last minute due to Christmas lurgies. It's very kind of him to do that. So I'm doing the ugly, the harsh. I'm going to be most harsh, and I actually agree with, to a certain extent, a lot of what Tom and Steve have said, and I think they were great presentations. But my job is to talk about what it could really mean, this bill, in the worst case scenario, how it is potentially deeply flawed. And I'm referring to the bill itself, not the policy statements and all the fine words that have been said around it, the actual bill itself. You could argue that the bill, like the fisheries bill, which is also on the table at the moment, is an empty vessel. And an empty vessel makes the most noise, promising much to many people. To those that want to look very green, it looks very green. To those who want to show campaign wins, it can show that you've won campaign things. But potentially, it could be delivering on an extremely strong neoliberal agenda of weak regulation, minimal allocation of budget to shiny green things in very special places, but eventually a rollback of all the support for farming that very few other Western affluent nations, bar New Zealand, have done. With no amendments to the bill, that's a real possibility. And I'll explain why. It's constantly referred to, I don't know if everybody understands what the way it's called, an enabling bill. It enables the Secretary of State and DEFRA to do things. That's a very nice, helpful word, it's a very pretty word, flexible, pragmatic, appropriate actions at the right time and the right moment. But it can also mean a total lack of accountability, total lack of parliamentary scrutiny, oversight, or adequate budgets, no adequate monitoring, no budgets, no targets. That's what an enabling bill can mean. And does it mean that? That's the big question. Putting specific persons aside, if we had a Secretary of State in place who cared nothing for the environment, not really, or market regulation, making sure the supply chain played fair, no really big interest in getting a budget to fit the scale of need of what we need to do to protect our home on which we live in, the natural systems, nature that we love. They had no real interest in any of that. A whole chunk of the bill is redundant. And there's little MPs could do about that at the moment. That's the real ugly and I hope unfair. It really depends on the dominance of the agenda of some parts of the governing party as we go forward. Which part of the who will win out in this play and who will be in place to decide on this. But if you actually believe Mr. Gove does actually want what he says he wants, the rhetoric he's talked about public goods, about paying for environmental protection, even health and harmony, and the contract between farmers and the public to be really transformed into a really good, positive, future, long-term change that protects our soil, our water, our air, as well as farming incomes and farm resilience. If you do believe that, there's still some fairly disagreeable parts of the bill. And I would categorise them as too empty, too narrow, and too late. So I'll quickly go on to what I mean by those three things. Too empty. So as I've said before, it's all about powers, no duties. There's a lot of words may all the way through the bill. If anybody's read the bill, it says the Secretary of State may do this, Secretary of State may do this, Secretary of State may do it. It doesn't say must, it doesn't say shall, it says may. So it enables the Secretary of State to do a lot of things. It doesn't mean they will. And there's no targets in there. There's also a big gap, really big gap in terms of money. So the vessel is potentially empty after 2021. So to pay for those future annuals, multi-annual schemes, the environmental land management schemes, the schemes which will make sure farming can transform, be productive, but also resilient and sustainable. The Treasury, we know, are not very keen on funding things like this. They're not really interested. Let regulation do the job. Let regulation make sure farmers protect the environment. Why should we? Let new markets pay for the rest. Let Nestle.
Just a test again.
For those who had too much cider last night, this must be really piercing hard.
How many people went to the event last night?
Some good cider I heard there. So Nestle play for clean water. Why should the government? So that's why it's too empty, and then we need amendments to the bill so that the Secretary of State is accountable and able to draw on a budget, able to do what he has currently said is needed, and he's identified. The assessment of need for what is actually required to give farmers what they need to do to protect the environment, to protect rural businesses. I think the House of Lords will come in hard on this part of it, the powers and duties. But we've got to think about this. If imagine in 2025, there's a massive change in our weather patterns, and we've got 5 counties we've not even thought about before. We need huge natural flood regeneration projects high upstream. How are we going to pay for it? How if there's no real accountability? 2 minutes, okay. Or just if we need to urgently protect peat soils, and we need to help farmers transfer their production somewhere else. Yeah, how do we do it if we haven't got genuinely good long-term resources and powers to do it? So my second point, too narrow. It's not addressing the systemic issues in the food system, from supply chains, protecting workers, to food waste and food safety. Budget considerations are paramount, but this bill could be doing so much more in a coherent way. It lacks the content to really tackle things like local food chains, making sure we have alternative retail and food service chains, so farmers can claw more back from the food pound into their businesses by actually having alternative. It really fails to do. Tom mentioned the fair dealing clause 27, and it's good that that's in there, but it doesn't go nearly far enough to really make sure that the supply chain will be regulated, all the supply chain, to be fair. What about the workers? 144,000 workers in the UK, nothing in there about them. Why? Their careers and jobs should be protected through a new body to make sure that they can demand good protection. It doesn't have a purpose to deliver on public health crises, obesity, public health crises to do with the diets. We could be doing so much more to get farmers transferring their production to be delivering good, healthy, fresh produce, like horticulture. And organic systems, agroecological systems, very little in there at the moment. Eustace has said he doesn't want to specify systems like organic because it opens a can of worms. That's not good enough. We really won't buy that. We really need to be supporting the regenerative systems that we know work. What about training and advice? So finally, also, the big way in which it's now, it doesn't tackle trade, and I haven't got time to go into that in detail, but obviously trade is a huge potential looming crisis for many farmers in terms of having to compete with imports and low standards. So my final point was it's too late. We've got to tackle climate change right now. It will be 9 years before the new environmental land management scheme is the new era for farming. 9 years. That's way too late to tackle the greenhouse gas emissions and boosting carbon sequestration for farming. What about obesity and soil loss? What about mega trade deals? They'll be going on whilst farmers are still in that transition. We need to transform farming really quickly for a whole new world. Resilient, responsive and sustainable farming. Isn't 9 years just too late? And we may, in that process, lose thousands of rural businesses, small and medium-sized farms. I don't think anybody's really grasped how the new system can make sure we don't have a massive hemorrhaging in our farms across the UK, which could be absolutely catastrophic for all sorts of reasons. So I've been quite harsh, I've been quite mean, too narrow, too empty and too late. I rest my case.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Shall we have a very quick show of hands for those that are with the good? Quick show of hands. Anyone? Okay, not many. Okay, right, good. So we've got about 5, 6. The bad. Raising hands on the bad. Okay, about the same. The ugly. Ooh, okay then.
It's a high rate of abstention.
Abstentions, quite abstentions. But the ugly seems to be leading on that one. Let's open it to the floor. Any particular question for that? Oh, yeah, also, when you're asking a question or making a very pithy statement, you don't have to say for whom you work. We're more interested in the free-thinking ideas about what's in the room rather than the partisan views of organisations. Quite an important point there.
Picking up on Vicky, your last point about people leaving, I think, as you mentioned, Tom, with the lump sum payment, with the hassle factor of new rules coming in to access whatever the payments are in future, plus with whatever happens on trade, it's likely that a lot of farmers will leave, and it's going to be easier for farms to consolidate than it will be to help new entrants in, however much investment goes into helping new entrants. I'd like to know from each of you what share of farmers you think will leave over the next 10 years, and what you think about that.
I think, well, it's impossible to put a number on it. I think there is probably a need, speaking from a sort of personal perspective, for renewal within the industry, and that's where I think the onus for progressive voices should be within that transition period, however long it might be, that we do get renewal rather than just straight consolidation. Because you're right, the hassle factor, the lack of certainty, things like delinking and being able to cash out using that facility could just lead to a whole load of people leaving, and then the larger, more capital-rich farmers just buy up the land. Or you could see a situation where large estates evict all of their tenants and cash in on forestry grants, which is already happening in Scotland. So that's what I mean about the need for an active state. So Theresa May talks a lot about an active state, but there's no real evidence of any of that coming through in policy. And I guess the concern would be Brexit bandwidth would distract from that, but there is an opportunity for renewal. It just needs a really active response to achieve it.
Well, we did a statement with CPRE, Sustain, CPRE, Land Works Alliance and others, because we were very concerned, I think, a year ago about the loss of diversity of farm systems. We could lose a whole load of farms. That's just, that's partly why I mentioned it. And I don't. There is still that risk, and there has been one study that suggests 25% of farms could be lost. And I think that represents a potential huge impact on rural cohesion and local economy, as well as environmental protection, because as farms get larger and larger, amalgamated into ever larger farms, you lose a lot of features, you lose a lot of potential for environmental and nature. So I think 25% maybe, and I think nobody is really making sure that that's not going to happen. We don't want to set everything in aspic. When we said that quite clearly in our statement, our farm diversity statement, there's always going to be an ebb and flow. But if this really accelerates it without any mitigation, I think there's potential huge risk. And I agree with Tom on we need active state to make sure that we can review that constantly and do things, change the system to make sure. I mean, one of the things that we're really worried about is the really small farms should have access to the environmental land management. Because they're small, if it's totally based on land area, they'll really lose out. So there needs to be a way of making sure that the small and really, small farms can access the funds.
Very shortly, so I know we're going to have some more questions.
There is a danger that we'll see big consolidation. Whether the lump sum payment type arrangement is a good or a bad thing is for debate. However, I know that there are lots of farmers out there. There are a number of farmers out there that can't afford to retire with dignity. They would like to retire, but they frankly can't, especially in the tenanted sector. And this may give them an opportunity to retire with some dignity. Having said that, I think there's a real missed opportunity, and something I've spoken to ministers about setting up a mechanism where new entrants, and it's tough to get into farming. I know I am a first generation farmer. It's tough to get in, but there could be a mechanism by way new entrants transition in with those outgoers over a period of time to set their business up, taking 25, 50, 75% over a couple of years and help them in as they help people transition out. That could be an opportunity.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, there was a question here, then there's one back there, then there's one here. Short questions, sorry, I'm going to have to say shorter answers because we've got about 22 minutes left and there's going to be a lot of topics that we want to try and cover. So,
it's just a statement from Landworkers Alliance, Jyoti and Ed Hayman and others have been campaigning really hard on including agroecology in the bill, and so they're running a campaign on encourage you to write to your MP to, and Labour Party have just tabled an amendment to include, which is great, to include agroecology in the bill, so you can engage in that.
Thank you, Julia Acklenby. I just want what help do you think the panellists think should be given to farmers to transition? The 7 years is a bit like a canyon with lots of rocks in it. 25% of farmers, it's great people retire with dignity, but actually between 80 to 100,000 pounds isn't going to be enough. Nobody can buy a house with 80 to 100,000 pounds, which is the average payment for those people. What support do you think would be better to give people support to change from where they are, and how much do you think England should invest in that support for farmers to become more resilient and respond to the new agenda?
I'm staggered by how many of my farming colleagues are sitting on their hands waiting to see what happens rather than being proactive and trying to shape future. Many don't want to jump because they don't want to jump the wrong way. But I think in answer to your question, there are lots of agricultural professionals out there and providing support to the farming community to help them plan for change, and change management is going to be really important. So, how that's done and how government support that, I'm not entirely sure, but providing outside third-party assistance to help farmers with change management has got to be beneficial.
We've always said that we need to keep the 3 billion and align it with the what we need to do here and make sure that's available, possibly even more. I totally agree with Steve that we need to provide free or very accessible, affordable advice to farmers in the transition. And I forgot what else I was going to say, but I think there needs to be the money there to do it, because we believe farming is a special case. So that should be available for the new era.
I think, well, just Stephen's point about farmers being proactive and everyone being proactive, I think, is the key thing. So, you know, government has zero bandwidth now, it's going to have zero bandwidth for the next decade. So expecting government to do it is not going to end well.
Thank you, Rob. David Gardner, really just picking up on Julia's point. I welcome the overall direction in terms of biodiversity and sustainability, but I just wondered what comments the panel might have on the broader aspect of rural businesses and supporting rural businesses. You've already mentioned the need for advice, but grant schemes, I feel if small farms are to survive, they can't survive as straight commodity producers. There's got to be something more there in terms of direct supply or alternative income streams. And I'd just like to hear what the panellists have got to say about that concept of developing what I would call a sustainable rural business rather than a sustainable farming business.
Also, say tree planting isn't a dirty word.
I remember what I was going to say, if I could follow on from you, because I think there was lots of things broken about the food system before Brexit, and the bill isn't going to mend a lot of those things, particularly inadequate returns from the supply chain. And, you know, we can want the break-up of the big multiples, so, you know, they don't have such dominance and concentration, so they have to bid for your goods more and pay more. But that may not happen, and what we need to see, I think you're right, is more local supply chains, alternative, local sustainable food going into schools and hospitals, and having alternative retail outlets. So I know land workers, again, are doing a lot on that. And
Wasn't
that's
Dave's
key.
question, but I think Dave's question was about non-food. Well, it was
Well,
about alternative land use. Okay.
Added value and non-food.
Okay, fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm probably work more on food, so
Yeah.
that's what I'm interested in.
Any thoughts on non-food production for farmers, alternative?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has already started happening and will accelerate is that land has been seen as farm or forestry land for primary production, and that has rather treated individual farmers as recipients of payments to do a particular activity and hamstrung those into or hem them into those activities. I think we're starting to see a move, and even more so under the bill, which will free up land use to be more multifunctional. So, picking up on the point I made about, you know, as a farmer you only have a certain level of skill sets. I think it's going to be increasingly important to team up with other people to work together on parcels of land or on farms where you can play to your own strength. So, you know, whether that's bringing a livestock partner in to operate livestock on your arable farm, or a grower or a retailer or an educationist or whatever, working together and having more than one person operating on a parcel of land will be possible going forward. It was more difficult historically.
I mean, we've been doing some work on our upland farm operations in particular to understand their sort of underlying economic performance, and, you know, like a lot of upland farm businesses, they don't look particularly good. So I think in the future we're looking at how can we add value to a sort of lower volume of produce, and how can we use the sort of landscape and biodiversity value of those places to add value and to cannibalise some of the roles within the supply chain where all of the profit sits. And that's what I mean about some of the provisions in the bill around producer organisations, you know, enabling farmers to cooperate more, to restrict supply, to process the product, to add value, and to therefore take all of the profit that sits in those mid-supply chain roles. Because just commodity producing land, which is what a lot of the uplands do, is not a viable proposition for the next 20 to 30 years.
Okay. This gentleman.
Hi, George Burbidge. I'm at a loss in a way because of the fact that it's not addressing the crisis we're actually facing. 1939 to 45, we had a really interventionist farm strategy, and the ensuing farm policies were very helpful in building agriculture and education, all sorts of areas. And this is what we're facing now in terms of the rest of the world, but also here. The amount of food we produce in this country is going down. And in fact, what we need to be producing as an all-round food supply, and increasing our self-reliance. And this bill doesn't address that. And the central issue is the issue of land. And this doesn't address the value of land and how it's completely disconnected with what we produce from it. And that's a fundamental thing.
Any thoughts on that? Could you hear that question about the fundamental use of the land for self-sufficiency? Value.
Yeah, and what you produce from it.
What you produce from it. Any quick thoughts? I'm going to keep moving around. Thank you for that.
I think, I'd say that's right. And I don't know what, there's some speculation about how it will affect the value of land in future, and I think people are making very wild speculations that aren't accurate about it bringing the price of land down. I'm not an expert on these things, but there's a risk that obviously people have speculated in land a lot over the last few years because it's a good investment.
Last 90 years.
Yeah, last 90 years, yeah. It doesn't really address that, and leaving it to the market to do it all. There's real risks in there. I suppose what we're looking for is for the environmental land management scheme and other schemes, and what Steve absolutely rightly talks about is farmers getting better at getting more from the market and working together, cooperating together to get more from the market will mean maybe they can get more value from their produce, but it's a big maybe, isn't it?
Can I say I'm concerned about the public goods bit, which we haven't really said, because how is that going to be measured? Who's going to be doing the measuring? And it's, on our farm, which we've been in environmental stewardship, countryside stewardship, whatever we call it this week, for the last 20 years. And, over that period of time, for example, we used to have grey partridge. They've all gone because there's too many badgers. That's another thing we'll probably very controversial. But if you're going to measure how many grey partridge we've got, then it's not my fault that there aren't any anymore, So I'm very concerned about how that's all going to be administered and measured.
John, you'll take that one.
Yeah, that sort of goes to the heart of how you're paid, what you're paid for. So I'm generally a bit sceptical about what DEFRA are talking about in terms of moving to a system based on sort of payments for outcomes.
Yeah.
Actually, I think payments for actions, which the evidence suggests will lead to a given outcome, is a much more reliable way for the farmer to understand how much they're going to get, and it's probably much more easy to administer for the state as well. So I think there's, in terms of wide-scale take-up of environmental measures, I think payments for actions is still, at least in the medium term, where we should focus, and payments for outcomes can be on more sort of high-end sort of habitat creation, restoration type projects like peatland and woodland creation and things like that.
Thanks.
I want to mention devolved nations. I live in Wales, where we have a separate consultation going underway at the moment called Brexit and Our Land. And farming doesn't know land boundaries, really. It doesn't know that farm's in Wales and this farm's here. So I'm concerned about two things that you mentioned now. Budget, because the Welsh Government will have to go to Westminster. So if we have no budget, we will have, it won't exist, really. And thinking about the environmental things, you say it's maybe a bit more slippery in England, possibly with the Westminster Government, whereas Wales, I think, is very committed and has shown that with other bills that we have, like the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And we've got a food consultation happening at the same time as our agricultural one. And again, I'd say what you said, that they do need to be meshing together. And I think other people in the room recognise, could speak on that more. If you have any insight into the environmental and budget side of things in relation to devolved nations.
Well, I think it's interesting. Can I just say something about the gentleman before? Just if you can get involved in any tests and trials on the environmental land management scheme, the more people involved and engaged with DEFRA on that, the better in terms of the outcomes from that. Which is a testing and trials. They're prepared to make mistakes, and so let's for a year or 2 years they're doing tests and trials on the scheme. So get involved. On what you were saying about food and linking and Wales losing out is a very, very big risk. We've also got food strategy potentially coming here, and I think Wales and Scotland are streets ahead in many ways about thinking about these things. But coherent government policy is such a nirvana that we're aiming for, making those links. We've just got to be shouting louder and talking to our MPs more and demanding more.
Just on the budget, there is a specific review being led by a guy called Lord Bew, who's at Queen's in Belfast, and that's the terms of that are only up till 2022 or the end of this Parliament, but inevitably whatever criteria they develop for allocating money across the 4 countries of the UK will be influential in the future. So getting engaged in that review.
What's that called?
It's the review of farm funding. If you Google review of farm funding Lord View, you'll find the terms of reference.
Okay, great, thank you. Lady here, please. We're down to the last 10 minutes, so it's going to be
Just
very
very
quick questions.
Surely the major problem is that so much land is used for growing food for animals, for livestock, and the health problems associated with that are not addressed. I mean, what I've learnt from coming to these conferences is about pasture for life and all that sort of thing. I'd really like to have seen more push for a change completely in land use, you know, because once you get away from producing land for grains for feeding livestock, the whole game changes, surely. I mean, can't people be pushing, you know, sustain or whoever, push for that kind of thing?
Steve, do you want to say a little bit agroforestry?
Well, no, I would say our biggest crop in the UK is grass, by a country mile. So, you know, there is a need for...
But the money's all about wheat, isn't it? And barley. And
well,
it's, you know, it's finishing off your cattle with barley. That's where the money is.
I think I think you know, your statement was about livestock.
Yeah.
So grass is by far the biggest crop. So there is a need to manage that grass some way.
What is most land grown for? It's grown for grains.
No,
in terms of arable,
it's
grown for grains, and grains go to feed livestock.
The biggest area of crop production is grass. Grains are a smaller percentage of it.
Yeah, but that's where the money is. Money's in growing wheat.
I think there'll be lots of discussions about that at this conference coming up. So if you go into the other events, there'll be lots of stuff around that.
I think it's worth saying there should be a land use strategy.
Including forestry,
exactly.
Other
All the needs from land should be.
This gentleman here.
Thanks. Christopher Stokes, with only a couple of minutes, and with ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, in view, what do the panel reckon is the best approach for ELMS to take to encourage agroecological and organic farming systems to deliver the system benefits and the public goods? So what do you say we should be arguing for within ELMS?
Okay, in one sentence.
Yeah, that's
one sentence, all three if you want, and then we'll move on to some other.
As
How can you deliver ELMS in one sentence?
As it's currently been designed around a land use plan, there is potential there because agroecological systems should be the whole land. So do tests and trials, submit tests and trials that actually show that a whole farm system can deliver on multiple outcomes, and those need to be measured and rewarded.
One sentence if you want to.
Allowing multifunctional land use.
Perfect. Allowing multifunctional land use.
Which isn't in the current schemes.
Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, it's, as with agri-environment schemes, ELMS is going to be a tool, so we just need to make sure that it includes all of the tools to enable more organic conversion and maintenance, and then beyond that, if you want to see more market demand, you'll have to look to other policies.
Gentleman, and then that lady after that.
Yep.
And then lady at the back.
Dave Stanley, if you don't agree with the problem, you don't agree with the solution. And this bill doesn't even begin to acknowledge the problem, which is fundamentally fossil fuels. If you look at the COP24 in Poland, the major outcome of that was we need to halve our fossil fuel consumption by 2030 and zero by 2050. The mess we're in with British agriculture and globally is down to fossil fuels. If we go in hard and re-specify there that efficiency is actually through minimum resource use rather than productivity per unit manpower, look for a taxation on fossil fuels, promote fossil fuel efficiencies, we will deliver all these aspects that are on the periphery and we'll get it right.
Thank you for that.
Hi, I'm Holly Tomlinson. Also coming from a Wales perspective, so did a lot of engagement with the Brexit in our land. We noticed that there was very little about access to land, and I wondered if, particularly for new entrants, and I was wondering if any of you could speak to that.
Access to land.
Yeah, I think it's a major issue. I think one of the things that isn't really in the frame of the bill is tax reliefs, and that's really one of the things that inflates land values. and they've not really been looked at for a long time, agricultural tax reliefs. So you might look at those to facilitate access to land as opposed to agricultural payments.
Simply one of the main barriers has been that the person who is responsible for a piece of land and is a recipient of whatever form of income or scheme or whatever they're engaged with, they're deemed to be the responsible entity, and current frameworks have actively prohibited multiple occupants on the same bit of land. So they've discouraged innovation, they've discouraged or prohibited innovation in terms of collaboration. So when I talk about multifunctional land use, I'd like to see multiple crops, multiple operators playing to their own skill sets. Currently that is not permitted because you've got to have a nominated individual or entity as a responsible person for cross compliance and payment and everything else. You can't have multiple people, and that's what we need to see a shift on.
Thank you.
Vicky mentioned that organic farming is being sort of put to one side in all this future stuff. And I find it hard to understand why. I mean, if you've sat through an organic inspection, there are animal welfare, environmental, all sorts of different things as well as just straight chemical use. Why is the environmental wildlife movement not throwing their weight behind organic, which already delivers a lot of these things without needing any more proofs?
The RSPB and other NGOs have always been really supportive of organic, and maybe we should be more vocally supportive.
Quietly.
Well, a lot of sharing's back. Get all kinds of arguments around.
Yeah, so actually it is a very active debate within the conservation sector.
It's a very big subject.
But actually, I've been really sort of admiring of some of the stuff that Helen's done at the Soil Association in terms of broadening the relevance of organic. And if you look at the purposes in clause 1 of the bill, which lists the public goods, it doesn't say organic, but it doesn't say wildlife or biodiversity either. So that's where perhaps some of the sort of where do you cut the detail off comes in. But absolutely, it should play a much bigger part in the future of farming.
Okay, thanks. Would you there, please? Yes.
Hi, my name's Magdal. I'm a researcher in the Scottish Parliament. I just wanted to dip in on go back to the devolved nations issue, and possibly clear up the idea that Scotland and Wales are further ahead, because the situation at the moment in Scotland is that Scottish ministers have refused to give legislative consent to the UK Agriculture Bill, which means the Agriculture Bill won't apply in Scotland. But they're also said that they're not planning to do an Agriculture Bill or a Fisheries Bill if they can at all help it. Their preferred position at the moment is for the power to be devolved to Scottish ministers rather than to the Scottish Parliament, which would mean that we could potentially see a new agricultural regime brought into force without any democratic participation whatsoever. So it's a deeply worrying situation in Scotland. We've had a consultation and a plan published so far for a 5-year transition period, which basically looks to seek regulatory alignment with the Common Agricultural Policy as much as possible. We're the only part of the UK that hasn't consulted yet on what happens beyond that transition period. So we're lagging really far behind, and particularly if anybody wants to show some solidarity and help us get an agriculture bill in Scotland, that would be fantastic.
Can I just clarify, I'm talking about the Good Food Nation process when I'm talking about Scotland,
so
not
it's
the agriculture.
been dropped by the Scottish Government as well.
Oh, well I take it all back.
Last couple of minutes, I think. Any more burning questions?
Can I just correct that?
Yes.
The Good Food Nation Bill hasn't been dropped. The consultation came out just before Christmas. And Nourish and most other NGOs in Scotland we're working with don't want an agricultural bill at the moment. Because the problem with the agriculture bill, the DEFRA agriculture bill, is it's hasty, ill-conceived, lacking in philosophical foundations, transparency, accountability mechanisms, and policy coherence. The last thing we want is a bill like that in Scotland.
Sure.
So we're going to do nation bill first, and then we'll get agriculture.
People are leaving the building. That means that I think we're coming to a conclusion. We've heard from Tom about better returns from the market for stuff that the market doesn't pay for. Steve, food wasn't mentioned enough, and let's be more collaborative. Vicky, too empty, too narrow, shiny green things. But from the discussions we've had, I think there's a lot more hope and interest and synergy and stuff that we can do. We as society, as also farmers, foresters and land managers, a lot more collaboration, a lot more shaking hands with people that you might not have met beforehand and sharing the ideas and finding that common ground. Thank you very much.